Terrance Washington stared at the viral video of himself in full military dress receiving the Distinguished Service Cross as millions watched online. 24 hours earlier, he'd been humiliated at the boarding gate, denied the first-class upgrade his white counterparts received. Now, everything was about to change. Before we dive into this incredible story of discrimination and vindication, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of their skin color. Now, let's uncover how a decorated soldier's worst travel experience became a catalyst for nationwide change. Major Terrance Jackson never asked for special treatment. The 38-year-old Army officer had built his 15-year military career on quiet competence, unwavering discipline, and a deep-seated belief that actions spoke louder than words. Born and raised in Baltimore's East Side, Terrance had seen more than his fair share of struggle growing up. After losing both parents in a car accident when he was just 9 years old, Terrance was raised by his grandmother, Eloise Jackson, a retired school teacher with an iron will and boundless compassion. Eloise instilled in him the values that would shape his character: integrity, perseverance, and the courage to stand up for what's right. My grandmother always told me that education and service were the twin paths to a meaningful life, Terrance reflected during an interview years later. She showed me that dignity isn't something others give you. It's something you claim for yourself. The neighborhood where Terrance grew up was plagued by violence and poverty. He lost 3 childhood friends to gang violence before graduating high school. While many of his peers were pulled into the streets, Terrance found refuge in books and JROTC. His academic excellence earned him a partial scholarship to Morgan State University, but the financial burden remained substantial. The military offered a path forward. Terrance enlisted in the Army immediately after high school graduation, seeing it not just as an escape from his neighborhood's cycle of violence, but as an opportunity to serve the country he loved, despite its flaws. The structure and purpose of military life suited him perfectly. "I believed the uniform would make me equal Terrance," once confided to a close friend. "That when people saw the stars and stripes on my shoulder, they'd see an American soldier first and a black man second, or better yet, just see a person worthy of the same respect as anyone else." Rising through the ranks, Terrance established himself as a natural leader with tactical brilliance. His career accelerated after his second deployment to Afghanistan in 2016, where he earned the reputation of being both fearless and level-headed. During an ambush in Kandahar province, Terrance's quick thinking and selfless courage saved 14 soldiers from his unit. Their convoy had been hit by multiple IEDs, followed by heavy gunfire from insurgents positioned in the surrounding hills. With 3 vehicles disabled and his commanding officer incapacitated, Terrance took charge. Despite sustaining a shrapnel wound to his leg, he organized a defensive position called in-air support and personally carried 2 injured soldiers to safety through active gunfire. Jackson ignored his own injuries and kept returning to the kill zone, read his official commendation. His actions directly resulted in 0 fatalities during an attack that should have decimated the entire unit. This act of heroism earned Terrance a Purple Heart and nomination for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for extreme gallantry and risk of life in combat. The approval process took years, but finally in spring 2025, Terrance received notification that he would be awarded the medal in a ceremony at the Pentagon. For Terrance, the recognition was bittersweet. While proud of his service, he remained haunted by the violence he'd witnessed and the persistent feeling that no matter how many medals adorned his chest, some Americans would never see past his skin color. Recent experiences had only reinforced this suspicion. Just 3 months before the scheduled ceremony, Terrance had been pulled over while driving his new SUV through an affluent Virginia suburb near his base. The officer approached with his hand on his weapon, demanded identification, and questioned why Terrance was in this neighborhood before running his license. No ticket was issued, no apology offered when the officer realized he was questioning a decorated major. A week later, a sales associate followed him throughout a department store while he shopped for a suit to wear to the ceremony. When he approached the counter to pay, the associate seemed surprised by his platinum credit card and asked to see ID, something Terrance noticed wasn't requested of the white customer ahead of him. These incidents weren't new. Throughout his life and career, Terrance had developed the calculated restraint many Black Americans learn as a survival skill. He chose his battles carefully, focused on excellence, and pushed forward. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. During difficult moments, they can only take your dignity if you hand it over. As the Pentagon ceremony approached, Terrance booked a flight from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, where he was attending a military conference, to Washington, D.C. He would travel in civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a navy button-down shirt, planning to change into his dress uniform upon arrival. This decision, seemingly insignificant at the time, would prove pivotal in the events to come. The night before his flight, Terrance called his grandmother. Now 84, Eloise's health prevented her from attending the ceremony, though she would watch the live stream from her Baltimore home. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she told him, her voice crackling with emotion. "But remember, those medals don't make you worthy. You were already worthy. They're just finally seeing what I've known since you were a boy." Terrance fell asleep that night, feeling grateful but unsettled, unaware that his journey to Washington would spark a national conversation about race, respect, and the true meaning of service. The morning of May 15th dawned bright and clear as Terrance arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. He wheeled his carry-on suitcase containing his meticulously pressed dress uniform toward the Atlantic Airways check-in counter, mentally rehearsing his acceptance speech for the following day. The agent Malcolm Reed, according to his name tag, barely looked up as Terrance approached. "The destination?" he asked flatly, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Washington, D.C. Reagan National." Terrance replied, sliding his ID and reservation confirmation across the counter. Malcolm glanced at the military ID, his eyes registering the information without any change in demeanor. "Checking any bags today?" "Just this one," Terrance said, lifting a small duffel onto the scale. As Malcolm processed the bag, a white passenger at the next counter caught Terrance's attention. The man, approximately Terrance's age, with a military haircut, presented his ID to another agent. "Thank you for your service, sir," the agent said warmly. "We appreciate everything you do for our country." The man, later identified as Kenneth Mitchell, nodded appreciatively. Terrance couldn't help but notice the stark difference in treatment. His own military ID had elicited no such recognition. "Your boarding pass," Malcolm said, sliding the document across the counter without making eye contact. "Gate B23. Next customer, please." Terrance made his way through security and toward his gate, the interaction, or lack thereof, lingering in his mind. It wasn't that he expected or wanted special treatment, but the disparity was hard to ignore. At Gate B, 23 passengers for the Washington, D.C. flight were already gathering. Terrance found a seat near the boarding area and pulled out his phone to check emails. About 40 minutes before departure, the gate agent, Heather Phillips, picked up the microphone. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're preparing to board Atlantic Airways Flight 1482 to Washington Reagan in approximately 20 minutes. At this time, I'd like to announce that we have several first-class upgrades available for our valued passengers." Terrance, a frequent flyer with Atlantic Airways and a member of their loyalty program for 8 years, perked up. He hadn't flown enough recently to maintain elite status, but as an active-duty service member traveling to an official ceremony, he knew the airline's published policy prioritized military personnel for available upgrades. Heather began calling names. "Mr. Kenneth Mitchell, we'd like to offer you a complimentary upgrade to first class today. Please approach the counter." Terrance watched as Kenneth, the same military man from check-in, approached the counter with a smile. 3 more passengers, all white, were called forward and presented with upgraded boarding passes. When no additional names were announced, Terrance politely approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said with a respectful nod. "I noticed you're offering upgrades today. I'm an active duty Army officer traveling to Washington for an official military ceremony. I believe Atlantic Airways has a policy regarding upgrade priority for service members." Heather's expression cooled noticeably. "Upgrades are based on loyalty program status only," she said curtly. "If you weren't called, you're not eligible." "I understand," Terrance replied evenly, "but I've reviewed your company's policy, which states that active military personnel are among those given priority consideration for available upgrades when space permits. I'm a gold member as well." "Sir, I've already assigned the available upgrades based on our standard protocols," Heather said, her tone dismissive. "If you'd like to purchase an upgrade, that would be an additional $349. From the corner of his eye, Terrance noticed Kenneth watching the exchange with a furrowed brow. Behind him in line stood another passenger, a young black woman who appeared to be filming discreetly with her phone. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Terrance clarified. "I'm simply inquiring about the consistent application of your stated policy." "Sir, if you continue to hold up the line, I'll need to call security," Heather said loudly, causing nearby passengers to turn and stare. "Please step aside for passengers who actually need assistance." The public rebuke stung, but Terrance maintained his composure. He nodded once and stepped away from the counter, aware of the eyes tracking him as he returned to his seat. When boarding began, Terrance lined up in his assigned group. As he reached the gate, Heather stopped him. "Sir, your carry-on appears too large for overhead storage. We'll need to check it." Terrance glanced at his standard carry-on suitcase, identical in size to those other passengers had rolled aboard without comment. "This is regulation size," he began. "It's a full flight," Heather interrupted. "Gate checking is complimentary." Reluctantly, Terrance surrendered his suitcase, which contained his carefully packed dress uniform for the ceremony. Moments later, Kenneth Mitchell boarded with a bag visibly larger than Terrance's, unchallenged by the same gate agent. Once aboard, Terrance made his way to his middle seat in row 23. As he settled in, Flight Attendant Bradley Cooper moved through the cabin assisting passengers. When Terrance requested a bottle of water, Bradley responded with barely concealed irritation. "Drink service will begin after takeoff," he said sharply, before offering a warm smile to the white passenger across the aisle who had made an identical request. The young black woman who had been filming at the gate took the window seat beside Terrance. After buckling her seatbelt, she leaned over. "That was completely unacceptable how they treated you," she said in a low voice. "I'm Maya Daniels, by the way. I work for Channel 7 News." Terrance introduced himself with a resigned smile. "Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. I noticed your military ID when you presented it at the counter," Maya said. "Are you traveling for work?" "Sort of," Terrance replied. "I'm receiving a medal tomorrow at the Pentagon." Maya's eyebrows shot up. "A medal? That's incredible. What for?" Distinguished Service Cross Terrance said, quietly uncomfortable with drawing attention to himself, "for an incident in Afghanistan a few years back." "That's the second highest military honor," Maya said, clearly impressed. "And they wouldn't give you an upgrade. That's more than just bad customer service. That's discrimination." Terrance shifted uncomfortably. "I can't prove that." "Maybe not alone," Maya replied, holding up her phone to show the video she'd captured. "But I'm a journalist, and I'm pretty good at asking questions." As the flight prepared for takeoff, Terrance wondered if he should just let the incident go. After all, tomorrow was about honoring his service, not creating controversy. But a voice in the back of his mind, one that sounded remarkably like his grandmother's, whispered that silence in the face of injustice only ensured its continuation. "Would you mind if I ask you a few questions about what just happened?" Maya asked once the seatbelt sign turned off. Her press credentials hung around her neck, partially concealed by her blazer. Terrance hesitated. Throughout his career, he'd witnessed countless microaggressions and blatant discriminatory incidents. His standard response was to rise above to prove his worth through excellence rather than confrontation. It had become almost instinctive to swallow the bitter pill of racism rather than risk being labeled difficult or playing the race card. "I appreciate your concern," he said carefully. "But tomorrow's ceremony is important. I don't want any distractions." Maya nodded respectfully but didn't back down. "I understand completely. But consider this. Your ceremony celebrates your courage in Afghanistan. Maybe this is another kind of battlefield one, where your example could make a difference." Her words struck a chord. Terrance recalled an incident from his second year as an officer when a black private in his unit had reported racial harassment. Terrance had advised the young soldier to focus on his performance instead of filing a formal complaint. "Don't give them ammunition," he'd said. Now he wondered if his guidance had perpetuated the very system he privately resented. "It happens more often than people realize," Terrance admitted quietly. "Last month I was seated in first class on a military charter, and 3 separate passengers asked if I was in the right seat." "And how did that make you feel?" Maya asked. "Like, no matter what I achieve, some people will always see me as out of place." As they continued talking, Terrance shared other experiences, being mistaken for kitchen staff at an officer's dinner, having white subordinates question his orders until confirmed by white colleagues, constantly feeling the need to be twice as prepared, twice as professional, and twice as restrained as his white counterparts. The hardest part, he confessed, is never knowing for sure if an interaction is influenced by race or just ordinary rudeness. You start second-guessing everything. Their conversation was interrupted when Kenneth Mitchell appeared beside their row. The first-class passenger looked uncomfortable as he introduced himself. "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help overhearing at the gate. You're military as well." Terrance nodded. "Major Terrance Jackson, U.S. Army. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Mitchell, Marines." Kenneth replied, extending his hand. "I'm also heading to the Pentagon ceremony tomorrow. Are you one of the honorees?" "Distinguished Service Cross," Maya interjected proudly before Terrance could respond. Kenneth's eyebrows shot up. Sir, that's incredible. I'm just attending as a representative. I can't believe they didn't upgrade you with that kind of decoration." "Apparently my status wasn't high enough," Terrance said with practiced neutrality. "That's nonsense," Kenneth replied. "I'm just a platinum member and my upgrade cleared automatically. Would you like to switch seats? I'd be honored." "I appreciate the offer, but that's not necessary," Terrance said. Kenneth frowned. "Well, something's not right. Let me speak with the flight attendant." Before Terrance could object, Kenneth approached Bradley Cooper, who was preparing the beverage cart near first class. Though they couldn't hear the full conversation, Terrance and Maya watched as Kenneth gestured toward their row with visible frustration. Bradley's response was loud enough to carry. "Some people are just looking for special treatment. If he wanted first class, he should have paid for it like everyone else." Kenneth's face reddened. "He's receiving the Distinguished Service Cross tomorrow. Do you understand what that means?" Bradley shrugged dismissively. "Everyone plays the race card these days." "Race card?" Kenneth repeated incredulously. "I never mentioned race, but now that you have, I'm wondering if that was a factor in your decision-making." The tension in the cabin thickened as nearby passengers turned to watch the exchange. Bradley quickly backpedaled, lowering his voice and directing Kenneth back to his seat with a promise to look into it. Kenneth returned to Terrance's row, visibly upset. That was completely inappropriate. His comment about a race card tells me everything I need to know about what happened at the gate. "Unfortunately, it's not surprising," Terrance replied. "Maybe not to you," Kenneth said, "but it should be unacceptable to everyone. My grandfather was a Montford Point Marine, one of the first Black Marines. He told me stories about segregated transport to and from combat zones during World War II. I thought we were past that. As Kenneth returned to his seat, promising to reconnect after landing, Maya turned to Terrance with renewed determination. "This is exactly why these stories need to be told," she said. "People like Bradley can pretend racism doesn't exist because they never have to experience it. Would you reconsider letting me look into this further?" Terrance stared out the window at the clouds below, his grandmother's voice echoing in his memory. "Dignity isn't something others give you, it's something you claim for yourself." "What exactly would that involve?" he finally asked. Maya explained that she had contacts who could verify the airline's policies and possibly access records of upgrade decisions. She wasn't proposing a major story before his ceremony, but wanted to gather information to determine if there was a pattern. "I have flight status alerts set up," she added, scrolling through her phone. "According to the upgrade list, you were actually ranked higher than 2 passengers who received upgrades. And look, the passenger manifest shows 4 open first-class seats when they only upgraded 4 passengers. There was room for you." The factual evidence was difficult to dismiss. As Maya continued her impromptu investigation, she made several discreet calls, speaking in hushed tones, while Terrance pretended to read a book. Atlantic Airways has had 3 discrimination lawsuits in the past 5 years, she reported after one call, all settled confidentially. By the time their flight began its descent into Reagan, National Terrance had reluctantly agreed to let Maya research the incident with the understanding that he would make no public statements until after his ceremony. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like jumping out of an aircraft during training. Jumps that moment of suspension before the parachute deployed. "I'm not looking to be the face of anything," Terrance clarified as they prepared for landing. "But if there's a pattern of discrimination, people should know. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones we choose." Maya replied, echoing the sentiment that had defined much of Terrance's life. "They're the ones that choose us." As the plane touched down in Washington, D.C., Terrance couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would change far more than his military record. For better or worse, he had taken the first step off a familiar path of silent endurance onto an uncertain road of accountability. The discrimination continued the moment the plane touched down at Reagan National Airport. As passengers prepared to deplane, Bradley Cooper returned to the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please remain seated until we've parked at the gate. Once the seatbelt sign is turned off, we invite our first-class passengers to deplane first, followed by our Platinum and Gold members." Terrance, a Gold member, stood when his tier was called, but Bradley immediately approached him. "Sir, we're still boarding Platinum members. Please wait your turn." An older white couple directly behind Terrance, wearing no visible status indicators, moved into the aisle unchallenged by the same flight attendant. Terrance caught Maya's eye, and she subtly adjusted her phone to capture the interaction. "I am a Gold member," Terrance said calmly, pointing to his boarding pass. Bradley's expression shifted from irritation to embarrassment as he verified the information. "My mistake," he muttered, before quickly moving to another section of the plane. After retrieving his gate-checked bag, which fortunately appeared undamaged, Terrance and Maya exchanged contact information in the terminal. "I'll do some digging and call you tomorrow after your ceremony," Maya promised. "And congratulations, Major Jackson. Your country owes you a debt of gratitude, even if some of its citizens fail to show it." Terrance's hotel troubles began immediately upon arrival at the Jefferson Grand, where the military had arranged accommodations for ceremony participants. The front desk attendant, a young white woman named Brittany, tapped at her computer with a frown. "I'm not seeing a reservation under Jackson," she said without looking up. "The confirmation was emailed to me yesterday," Terrance said, presenting his phone with the reservation details clearly displayed. "Oh, that's strange," Brittany replied, finally glancing at the screen. "It shows as canceled in our system." "Canceled by whom?" "I don't have that information," she said. "And unfortunately, we're fully booked tonight due to several conferences. Frustration mounting, Terrance stepped aside and called his commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison. "Jackson, everything all right? You've arrived in D.C., the colonel asked. "Yes, sir, but there seems to be an issue with my hotel reservation. It was confirmed yesterday but shows as canceled now." "That's unacceptable," Harrison replied, his voice tight with anger. "Put the front desk manager on the phone." Terrance returned to the counter and politely requested a manager. A middle-aged man named Scott appeared moments later, taking the phone with visible reluctance. The conversation was brief but effective. Colonel Harrison's authoritative tone carried clearly enough for Terrance to catch phrases like distinguished honoree and inexcusable oversight. Within minutes, Scott was apologizing profusely and personally escorting Terrance to a corner suite, compliments of the hotel. Alone in his room, Terrance carefully unpacked his dress uniform, inspecting every detail. The Distinguished Service Cross ceremony required absolute perfection in appearance. As he arranged his ribbons and insignia, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from his grandmother. "Everything all right, baby?" Eloise asked, her intuition as sharp as ever despite her advancing years. "Just some travel hiccups," Terrance replied, unwilling to worry her with details. She hummed, unconvinced. "I've known you since you were in diapers, Terrance Jackson. Don't you go protecting me from the truth." With a sigh, Terrance relented, sharing the incidents from the airport and hotel. His grandmother listened quietly until he finished. "You know, she finally said your grandfather faced similar treatment after returning from Korea. Decorated soldier who couldn't get served at lunch counters back home." "I know, Grandma. Things are better now, but..." "Better isn't the same as right," she interrupted. "He used to say silence is sometimes mistaken for acceptance." "What do you think I should do?" Terrance asked, realizing he was seeking guidance from her, just as he had throughout childhood. "That medal they're giving you tomorrow? It's for exceptional courage, isn't it? Courage comes in many forms, baby. Sometimes it's running into gunfire. Sometimes it's speaking truth when it would be easier to stay quiet." The wisdom of her words resonated deeply. Before he could respond, a knock at his door announced the arrival of Colonel Harrison, who had insisted on personally checking that the hotel situation was resolved. All squared away, Jackson, Harrison asked, stepping into the room. "Yes, sir. Thank you for your intervention." Harrison waved off the gratitude. "I understand there was an incident on your flight as well." Terrance hesitated. "Nothing worth reporting, sir." "That's not what I heard," Harrison replied. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell contacted me. Seems there may have been discriminatory treatment by airline staff." Surprise rendered Terrance momentarily speechless. Kenneth had escalated the issue without prompting. "With respect, sir, I'd prefer to focus on tomorrow's ceremony." Harrison studied him for a long moment. "Your call, Jackson. But for what it's worth, the Army doesn't tolerate discrimination against its soldiers from any quarter. If you decide this is worth pursuing, you'll have institutional support." After the colonel departed, Terrance received a text from Maya containing several screenshots. Found Atlantic Airways upgrade policy, her message read, "Military personnel in uniform OR with ID traveling on orders are second priority after Platinum Plus members." Also found social media posts from other Black passengers reporting similar experiences with the same airline. "Call me when you can." Before Terrance could reply, another knock announced Kenneth Mitchell, still in his traveling clothes but now bearing a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Thought you might want some company," Kenneth said. Pre-ceremony nerves are always easier with a drink and conversation. Over drinks, Kenneth revealed that his interest in the situation wasn't random. His grandfather, one of the first Black Marines, had shared stories of discrimination that shaped Kenneth's worldview. "He told me about returning from combat in the Pacific still in uniform and being forced to give up his seat on a bus to a white civilian," Kenneth recounted. Said that moment hurt worse than his battle wounds. "Did he ever receive recognition for his service?" Terrance asked. "Too late," Kenneth replied grimly. "They gave the Montford Point Marines a Congressional Gold Medal in 2012. He died in 2009. The conversation shifted to the ceremony, with Kenneth expressing genuine admiration for Terrance's actions in Afghanistan. As they talked, Terrance's phone buzzed repeatedly with updates from Maya, who was piecing together evidence of a troubling pattern at Atlantic Airways. Her final message of the evening landed like a thunderbolt. "Got security footage from gate area through a contact. Clear evidence Heather Phillips upgraded passengers with lower status than yours. Company policy explicitly violated. This wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate exclusion. We need to talk." Staring at the message, Terrance felt a familiar crossroads approaching the choice between dignified silence and justified confrontation. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. Courage comes in many forms. Would he continue the tradition of accommodation that had carried him through his career? Or would he take a stand knowing the potential for backlash against a black man accusing a major corporation of racism? The Distinguished Service Cross in its velvet case sat on the desk beside his phone, a symbol of courage under fire. Tomorrow, he would be celebrated for running toward danger when others fled. But some battlefields didn't have clear front lines, and some acts of courage required no weapons, but carried equal risk. Have you ever witnessed discrimination but stayed silent to avoid conflict? Comment number 1 if you believe speaking up against injustice is always worth the potential backlash. Hit like if you think Terrance should focus on his ceremony and address the airline issue afterward. Subscribe to join our community of storytellers and truth seekers who believe in holding powerful institutions accountable. What would you do in Terrance's position? Would you risk overshadowing your moment of recognition to shine light on discriminatory practices? Or would you compartmentalize dealing with one battle at a time? The choice Terrance makes will have ripple effects far beyond this single incident, as we'll see in our next segment. Dawn broke over Washington, D.C. with a brilliance that matched the significance of the day. Terrance rose early, his routine military precision amplified by the ceremony's importance. He showered, shaved with meticulous care, and began the deliberate process of donning his dress uniform. Each element had specific placement requirements, ribbons precisely measured from the pocket edge badges aligned to the millimeter. Terrance's fingers moved with practiced efficiency, though his mind remained divided between the honor awaiting him and the discrimination he had encountered. As he fastened the last button on his jacket, the mirror reflected a soldier in perfect military, bearing the visual embodiment of discipline and excellence. The Pentagon ceremony was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. in the courtyard, where distinguished guests and military leadership would gather to honor 5 service members receiving decorations for extraordinary heroism. Terrance arrived 90 minutes early, as was his habit for important events. The historic 5-sided building hummed with activity as uniformed personnel and civilian employees navigated its 17 miles of corridors. A junior officer escorted Terrance to a preparation room where the other honorees were gathering. Among them was a Navy SEAL receiving the Navy Cross, 2 soldiers receiving Silver Stars, and an Air Force pararescueman also receiving the Distinguished Service Cross. As Terrance entered the conversation, paused momentarily, several sets of eyes tracking his movement. He had grown accustomed to being the only black officer in such settings, the momentary assessment that often preceded acceptance. Before awkwardness could settle, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Major Jackson, glad you made it through the travel chaos." Kenneth Mitchell approached with a warm smile, introducing Terrance to the group. "Gentlemen, this is the officer I was telling you about. His unit was ambushed in Kandahar. 14 men made it home because of him." The atmosphere immediately warmed professional respect, transcending any initial hesitation. As the honorees exchanged stories, Terrance was struck by their shared experiences, not just in combat, but in the challenges of returning to civilian environments, where their sacrifices were often invisible or misunderstood. A Pentagon aide appeared at the door. "Gentlemen, the secretary will see you before the ceremony." They were escorted to a conference room where the Secretary of Defense, Eleanor Matthews, waited to personally thank each recipient. A formidable woman with 3 decades of military and public service experience, Secretary Matthews had a reputation for directness and unwavering support for troops. "Major Jackson," she said firmly, grasping Terrance's hand, "I reviewed your action report personally. Extraordinary courage under fire. Your quick thinking saved not just American lives, but 3 Afghan interpreters as well. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Those interpreters saved our unit numerous times before that day." I was just returning the favor. Something in Terrance's demeanor must have communicated his divided attention. Secretary Matthews tilted her head slightly. "Something troubling you, Major Pre-Ceremony jitters, are normal even for battle-tested officers." "No, ma'am. It's an honor to be here." Secretary Matthews held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once. "The nation is grateful for your service, Major Jackson. All of your service, seen and unseen." As the ceremony time approached, Terrance spotted Maya entering the courtyard with other media representatives. She caught his eye and gave a subtle thumbs up. She had kept her promise to attend, though Terrance had requested she not pursue any airline-related inquiries until after the ceremony. The courtyard filled with military personnel in dress uniforms, government officials, and family members of the honorees. Terrance had arranged for the ceremony to be live-streamed, so his grandmother could watch from her home in Baltimore. In the front row, he spotted Kenneth seated beside an older man with general's stars on his shoulders. Kenneth had mentioned his mentor would attend, but hadn't specified it was General William Simmons, the first black commandant of the Marine Corps. At precisely 10:00 a.m., a military band began playing the Star-Spangled Banner, and the ceremony commenced. The late spring sunlight glinted off brass insignia and polished shoes as Pentagon leadership took their positions on the stage. Secretary Matthews approached the podium, her voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority. "Today we recognize extraordinary Americans who have demonstrated courage above and beyond the already high expectations we place on our armed forces. These individuals faced unimaginable danger, and in those critical moments thought not of themselves, but of their comrades and their mission." As the secretary read the citations for each decoration, Terrance's mind flashed back to that day in Kandahar. The memory came not in the sanitized language of official reports, but in sensory fragments, the copper smell of blood mixing with diesel fuel, the grit of sand between his teeth as he crawled toward a wounded soldier, the searing pain in his crawled in the sanimal leg that he'd managed to ignore until all his men were accounted for. Major Terrance Jackson, the secretary's voice, cut through his thoughts. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Terrance stepped forward with the measured pace drilled into him since basic training. As the secretary continued reading the citation detailing his actions, he maintained the stoic expression expected of a soldier, though internally emotion threatened to overwhelm him. He thought of his parents, who never lived to see the man he became, of his grandmother watching proudly from her living room, of the men he'd served with, some who never made it home. Secretary Matthews lifted the Distinguished Service Cross from its case. A bronze cross with an eagle at its center suspended from a red, white, and blue ribbon. As she pinned it to Terrance's uniform, she spoke quietly for his ears only. "Your country is better because of men like you, Major. Never forget that." Terrance managed a crisp "Thank you, Madam Secretary," as photographers captured the moment. He executed a perfect about-face and returned to his position, now wearing his nation's second highest military decoration. After all recipients had been honored, Terrance approached the podium to deliver acceptance remarks on behalf of the group. He had prepared and memorized a speech focusing on teamwork duty and the honor of military service, safe expected themes for such an occasion. But as he looked out at the assembled crowd, he saw Maya's encouraging nod, Kenneth's respectful attention, and General Simmons' dignified presence. He thought about his grandmother's words about different forms of courage, and the airline staff who had judged him unworthy of basic dignity despite his service. In that moment, Terrance made a decision to deviate slightly from his prepared remarks. It is the highest honor to stand before you today, representing not just myself, but all those who served alongside me. This medal recognizes a single moment of action, but true service is found in the thousands of unseen moments, the daily commitment to duty, honor, and country. I believe that service is not confined to the battlefield. It continues when we return home and extend the same values of respect, equality, and dignity to all Americans that we fight to defend overseas. Sometimes standing for those values requires as much courage in civilian settings as it does in combat. As service members, we wear this uniform with pride, knowing it represents the highest ideals of our nation. We hope that when others see it, they recognize not just our willingness to sacrifice, but the fundamental American belief that all people deserve equal treatment and respect. The courtyard remained silent for a beat after Terrance concluded, then erupted in applause. Secretary Matthews nodded approvingly, while General Simmons stood to join the standing ovation. In the press section, Maya wiped away a tear while continuing to film. At the reception following the ceremony, Terrance was approached by reporters from various media outlets, including Maya's station. While others asked standard questions about his military experience and the decorated action, one reporter posed a question that opened the door to what had been weighing on Terrance's mind. "Major Jackson, how was your journey to today's ceremony?" Terrance hesitated, aware that his response could shift the focus from his military achievement to a controversial topic. But looking at his Distinguished Service Cross, he remembered what it represented: the courage to do what's right, regardless of personal cost. My journey included some challenges that had nothing to do with military service and everything to do with how we see each other as Americans, he began carefully. While traveling in civilian clothes yesterday, I experienced discrimination from Atlantic Airways staff, who denied me a service upgrade that their policy grants to military personnel while extending that courtesy to white service members. The press room fell silent, cameras still rolling. I didn't mention this earlier because today's ceremony honors not just me, but all who serve. However, I believe that confronting discrimination is another form of service to our country and its ideals of equality and justice. As reporters rapidly fired follow-up questions, Maya stepped forward. "I witnessed the incident and have gathered evidence suggesting this wasn't an isolated occurrence. Atlantic Airways has a documented pattern of such behavior." The statement unleashed a flurry of activity as reporters began making calls and typing on their devices. Within minutes, Maya's station broke the story, showing the footage she had captured at the gate, juxtaposed with images of Terrance receiving his Distinguished Service Cross. The contrast was stark and compelling: a decorated hero treated with disrespect by a major airline one day, then honored at the Pentagon the next. The story immediately gained traction, with the hashtags #RespectOurVeterans and #FlyingWhileBlack trending on social media platforms. As Terrance departed the Pentagon that afternoon, his phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Kenneth caught up with him at the exit. "That took courage, speaking up like that," Kenneth said. "Different kind of courage than Afghanistan, but just as important." "I'm not sure if it was the right call," Terrance admitted. "This should have been about the ceremony, not airline policies." "With respect, sir," Kenneth replied, "it was about something much bigger than either one. It was about who we are as a country and whether we truly live up to the ideals we send our soldiers to defend." As they parted ways, Terrance couldn't have predicted how quickly events would unfold, nor how his decision to speak truth would catalyze a movement much larger than one man's experience. By evening, what had begun as a personal account following a military ceremony had exploded into a national conversation. Terrance's hotel room became a command center of sorts, his phone ringing incessantly with calls from news outlets, military colleagues, and supporters. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Distinguished Service Cross Recipient Describes Racial Discrimination by Atlantic Airways." MSNBC followed with "American Hero Denied Service While White Soldiers Upgraded." Fox News took a different angle. Military Decoration Ceremony Overshadowed by Discrimination Claims. Social media platforms amplified the story exponentially. Video clips of Terrance's Pentagon statement intercut with Maya's footage from the airport spread like wildfire. Veterans groups expressed outrage, with the American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars issuing statements condemning the airline's treatment of a decorated soldier. Maya called shortly after 7 p.m., her voice animated with professional excitement. "It's everywhere, Terrance. My station ran it as our lead story at 5, and now all the national networks have picked it up." Atlantic Airways stock dropped 8% in after-hours trading. "That wasn't my intention," Terrance replied, genuinely concerned about the escalating situation. "Maybe not, but it's the consequence of their actions, not yours," Maya countered. "Their CEO just issued a statement. Want to hear it?" She read from her notes. "Atlantic Airways takes allegations of discrimination extremely seriously. We have launched an internal investigation into the reported incident involving Major Jackson. Our company has the utmost respect for military personnel and maintains strict policies prohibiting discrimination of any kind." "Sounds like standard corporate damage control," Terrance observed. "Exactly," Maya agreed. "Generic, non-committal, and not actually addressing what happened." But here's where it gets interesting. "I've received 17 emails since our broadcast from current and former Atlantic Airways employees alleging similar incidents. 3 black pilots described being repeatedly questioned about their qualifications by both passengers and fellow crew members. 5 flight attendants reported racial bias in crew assignments and promotions." The conversation was interrupted by a call from Colonel Harrison. "Jackson, you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest," Harrison said without preamble. "I apologize if this has created difficulties for the Army," Sir Terrance responded formally. "Difficulties?" Harrison chuckled. "Son, the Secretary of Defense just held an impromptu press conference expressing full support for your right to be treated with dignity. The Pentagon's official position is that discrimination against service members is unacceptable in any context." Relief washed over Terrance. "Thank you for letting me know, sir." That said, Harrison continued, his tone sobering. "Not everyone's pleased with how this has unfolded. Some feel military matters should remain separate from social issues. You're likely to face some backlash." Harrison's prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. Within hours, conservative commentators began questioning Terrance's agenda and timing, suggesting he had orchestrated the incident to gain publicity or advance political aims. Sebastian Reynolds, a prominent talk show host, devoted his evening segment to attacking Terrance's credibility. Why wait until after receiving a prestigious medal to make these accusations? Could it be that Major Jackson was looking to maximize attention? Many are asking whether this is truly about discrimination or simply another attempt to weaponize race for personal gain. The vitriol intensified on social media, where anonymous accounts posted increasingly threatening messages. One particularly disturbing thread suggested Terrance had exaggerated his military accomplishments and didn't deserve his decoration. Kenneth called around midnight, his voice tight with anger. "Have you seen what they're saying about you online? This is absolutely unacceptable. My JAG friends say this could constitute defamation." "I expected some pushback," Terrance admitted, "but not attacks on my service record." "The Marine Corps has your back," Kenneth assured him. "General Simmons is furious. He's making calls." Atlantic Airways' initial strategy involved distancing the company from the actions of individual employees. By morning, they announced that Heather Phillips and Bradley Cooper had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. effectively positioning them as scapegoats for what Maya's reporting increasingly revealed as systemic issues. CEO Richard Blanchard appeared on morning television programs projecting concerned leadership. The behavior described does not reflect our company values or training protocols. We are cooperating fully with investigations and will take appropriate action based on findings. But the company's attempt to control the narrative unraveled when an anonymous employee leaked internal communications to Maya. The emails revealed that multiple discrimination complaints had been filed against the same gate agent over the past year, all dismissed without thorough investigation. More damaging was a memo from senior leadership instructing customer service representatives to prioritize high-value customers during irregular operations, with an unofficial scoring system that consistently disadvantaged passengers from predominantly minority zip codes. By noon, Atlantic Airways stock had dropped 12%, and calls for boycotts spread across social media platforms. The airline's attempt to limit damage by offering Terrance complimentary first-class travel for a year was widely criticized as tone-deaf. "They think this is about free upgrades," Maya said during a phone call with Terrance. "They're completely missing the point." The backlash against Terrance turned uglier that afternoon when his grandmother called in tears. "Someone spray-painted terrible words on my front door," Eloise said, her voice shaking. "The neighbors are helping clean it up, but I'm scared, baby." Terrance's blood ran cold. "I'm coming home right now." "No," she insisted firmly. "You've started something important. Finishing it honors those who couldn't speak up. Your grandfather would be proud." Before Terrance could argue, Colonel Harrison called again. "We're aware of the situation at your grandmother's residence. Military police are coordinating with Baltimore PD to provide security. This crosses a line, Jackson. We protect our own." The incident at his grandmother's home transformed the story yet again. Veteran groups organized a supportive vigil outside Eloise's house, with former service members standing guard throughout the night. Images of elderly veterans in their military caps, forming a protective circle around a Black grandmother's home, created powerful symbolism that transcended partisan divides. Atlantic Airways, recognizing the deteriorating public relations situation, attempted a more direct approach. Terrance received a call from the airline's general counsel, offering a substantial financial settlement in exchange for a confidentiality agreement and public statement of resolution. "They're offering $300,000, Terrance told Maya during their daily briefing. "All I have to do is sign an NDA and say the matter has been amicably resolved." "That's their playbook," Maya replied. "Pay for silence, make cosmetic changes, wait for public attention to shift elsewhere, then return to business as usual." Terrance stared at the settlement documents, thinking about what the money could mean for his grandmother's medical expenses and future security. The amount represented more than 3 years of his military salary. But accepting would mean no structural changes at the airline, no protection for future passengers facing similar discrimination. It would convert a movement for accountability into a private transaction. His grandmother's wisdom once again provided clarity. Dignity isn't something others give you, it's something you claim for yourself. Terrance called Atlantic Airways' legal department with his decision, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm declining." This isn't about compensation. It's about changing a culture that allows discrimination to persist. The rejection of such a substantial settlement made headlines, shifting public perception further in Terrance's favor. A Gallup poll released the following day showed 72% of Americans believed his account and supported his decision to speak out. As the story entered its 5th day, the airline's board of directors called an emergency meeting. CEO Richard Blanchard's leadership was under scrutiny not just for the initial incident, but for the company's fumbling response. Internal documents continued to leak, including a recording of Blanchard dismissing early discrimination complaints as oversensitivity and suggesting that certain passengers were looking for handouts. The final blow came when Maya's investigation uncovered Blanchard's history of racially insensitive comments at industry events and his resistance to diversity initiatives recommended by Human Resources. After a 6-hour board meeting, Atlantic Airways announced Blanchard's resignation to pursue other opportunities. In his place, the board appointed Angela Reynolds, a respected Black executive with experience in corporate turnaround situations. Her first official act was to request a meeting with Terrance, not through intermediaries, but with a personal phone call. "Major Jackson," she said when he answered. "This is Angela Reynolds, new CEO of Atlantic Airways. I'd like to speak with you directly, no lawyers, no PR team. Just a straightforward conversation about what happened and how we fix it." Terrance agreed to the meeting, recognizing that real change would require engagement rather than continued confrontation. As the week drew to a close, he found himself at the center of a national conversation much larger than one airport incident. A discussion about respect, equality, and the gap between American ideals and everyday realities. Angela Reynolds chose a small neutral conference room at the National Air and Space Museum for her meeting with Terrance. She arrived alone, dressed in a simple navy suit with no entourage of executives or public relations specialists, a stark departure from corporate protocol in crisis situations. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." She began extending her hand. No recording devices, no prepared statements, just an honest conversation. Terrance appreciated the approach. "Transparency is all I've wanted from the beginning." Angela nodded, her expression serious. "I've spent the last 48 hours reviewing every document related to your experience and the larger pattern at Atlantic Airways. What happened to you was inexcusable and unfortunately not isolated." She placed a folder on the table between them. "This contains internal data on passenger upgrades over the past 3 years, broken down by demographics. The disparities are statistically significant and indefensible. Black passengers with identical status levels were passed over for upgrades at a rate 4 times higher than white passengers." "I suspected as much," Terrance replied, "but seeing the numbers makes it more concrete. The previous leadership created a culture where complaints were systematically dismissed," Angela continued. "Employees who raised concerns were labeled not team players and often relegated to less desirable routes or schedules." She slid another document across the table, a formal letter of apology on Atlantic Airways letterhead. "This will be published in major newspapers tomorrow. No corporate jargon, no qualified language. A straightforward acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to change." Terrance read through the letter carefully. Unlike typical corporate apologies designed by legal teams to minimize liability, this statement was refreshingly direct. Atlantic Airways acknowledges that Major Terrance Jackson experienced racial discrimination while traveling with our cause. Airline. We accept full responsibility for this failure and the pattern of similar incidents that our internal review has uncovered. Discrimination in any form contradicts both our stated values and basic human dignity. "This is unexpected," Terrance admitted. "Most companies would still be in denial at this stage." "I'm not most executives," Angela replied, with a hint of steel in her voice. "I've been on the receiving end of similar treatment throughout my career. The difference is that I'm now in a position to create systemic change rather than just personal workarounds." She outlined a comprehensive transformation plan for Atlantic Airways' mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff, revised upgrade protocols with transparency and accountability measures, the establishment of a lot of revel of them, diversity and inclusion office, reporting directly to the CEO, and a commitment to increase diversity in leadership positions by 50% over 3 years. Most importantly, Angela emphasized, we're creating a customer advocacy board with real authority to review complaints and recommend policy changes. I'd like you to consider serving on that board, Major Jackson. The invitation caught Terrance off guard. I'm still active duty military. My involvement could be complicated. Precisely why your perspective would be valuable, Angela countered. This isn't about optics or token representation. Your experience bridges military and civilian worlds in ways that could help us create meaningful change. As they continued their discussion, protesters gathered outside Atlantic Airways headquarters in Dallas. The company's stock had dropped 17% since the incident became public, and shareholders were demanding accountability beyond executive resignations. Meanwhile, the backlash against Terrance intensified from certain quarters. Conservative media outlets pivoted from questioning his motives to portraying him as an agent of woke capitalism intent on destroying American businesses. Online threats became so concerning that military intelligence flagged several as credible security risks. Colonel Harrison called with an update that evening. "We've identified individuals behind the most serious threats. FBI is involved now. As a precaution, we're assigning a security detail to both you and your grandmother until this settles down." The situation escalated further when Sebastian Reynolds, the talk show host who had initially attacked Terrance's credibility, devoted an entire segment to what he called the militarization of racial grievance. "What we're witnessing is the weaponization of military honors to advance a political agenda," Reynolds declared to his millions of viewers. Major Jackson may have served honorably in Afghanistan, but his attack on a struggling American airline during economic uncertainty raises serious questions about his judgment and loyalty to American institutions. The segment featured guests questioning whether the Distinguished Service Cross had been awarded based on merit or diversity considerations, an insinuation so outrageous that it prompted an unprecedented response from the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense held a press conference specifically to address the allegations. The Distinguished Service Cross is awarded based on extraordinary heroism in combat, documented by multiple witnesses and evaluated through a rigorous process, Secretary Matthews stated firmly. Any suggestion that Major Jackson's decoration was influenced by factors other than his exceptional courage under fire is not only false but disrespects every service member who has received this honor. The military community largely rallied behind Terrance. Veterans organizations issued statements of support, and current service members shared their own experiences with discrimination while traveling in uniform. General Simmons appeared on several news programs, providing context about historical discrimination against black military personnel and the importance of confronting ongoing inequities. "When I joined the Marines in 1978, I was told to expect disrespect in civilian settings regardless of my uniform," General Simmons recounted. "We accepted that reality as the cost of service. Major Jackson's generation shouldn't have to make that same compromise. Equality isn't a political position, it's an American principle." Kenneth Mitchell also became an unexpected ally and spokesperson, using his position as a white officer to redirect conversations about playing the race card into substantive discussions about observable patterns of discrimination. "I witnessed the different treatment firsthand," Kenneth emphasized during a CNN interview. "This isn't about politics or generating controversy. It's about ensuring that all Americans, especially those willing to die for their country, are treated with basic dignity and respect." The pressure on Atlantic Airways continued to mount as employees, emboldened by the public conversation, began sharing their experiences more openly. Black pilots described being frequently mistaken for service personnel by passengers and sometimes by their own colleagues. Flight attendants revealed unofficial but widely practiced seating policies that placed black passengers in less visible areas of aircraft, particularly in first and business class sections. A class action lawsuit began taking shape with dozens of passengers coming forward with similar experiences of discrimination. The legal team representing these individuals contacted Terrance about serving as a lead plaintiff, a role he was hesitant to accept given his active duty status. The military generally discourages service members from becoming involved in high-profile litigation, his JAG advisor explained during a consultation. That said, there are exceptions for civil rights matters, particularly when the issue directly impacts military personnel. Terrance's decision was complicated by escalating threats against his grandmother. Despite the security detail, Eloise received anonymous calls warning her to control your grandson before things get worse. The psychological toll became evident when she was hospitalized briefly for elevated blood pressure and anxiety. "I'm considering backing away from this," Terrance confided to Maya during a late-night phone call. "My grandmother's safety has to come first." "I understand completely," Maya replied with genuine sympathy. "But consider what your grandmother herself would say. You've told me how she raised you to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." As if confirming Maya's assessment, Eloise checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice and gave an impromptu interview to local Baltimore news from her front porch surrounded by veteran supporters. "My grandson protected American values on foreign soil," she stated with quiet dignity. "Now he's protecting those same values right here at home. I couldn't be prouder of him, and I won't let threats stop either of us from doing what's right." The video of Eloise's statement went viral, transforming her into a symbol of resilience and moral clarity. When several prominent civil rights organizations offered to provide additional security and support for her, public attention shifted from Terrance's individual experience to the broader implications for military families and communities of color. Atlantic Airways board recognized that the situation had evolved beyond conventional crisis management. In an emergency session, they unanimously approved Angela Reynolds' comprehensive reform plan and allocated $30 million toward its implementation. More significantly, they agreed to participate in an industry-wide audit of customer service practices related to minority passengers. As these corporate changes unfolded, Terrance received an unexpected communication from Heather Phillips, the gate agent who had denied his upgrade. Her email sent to his military address reflected the complex human dimensions behind institutional behaviors. "Major Jackson," she wrote, "I've spent the past week reflecting on my actions and the larger context you've helped expose. While I could offer excuses about company culture or implicit biases, the truth is simpler. I failed to treat you with the basic respect every human deserves regardless of uniform or rank. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just acknowledging a truth that needed to be spoken. Your courage has forced me to confront assumptions I didn't even realize I carried." The note contained no request for intervention in her employment situation, no attempt to explain away her actions, just a straightforward acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Terrance found it more meaningful than any corporate statement or legal settlement. As the second week of the controversy began, Terrance received notification of his promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, a career advancement that had been in process well before the Atlantic Airways incident, but now carried additional significance. The timing created an opportunity for the military to demonstrate its position on the matter through the promotion ceremony. Colonel Harrison called with the news. "The Chief of Staff wants to make a statement with your promotion ceremony, Jackson. Very public, very clear. The Army stands behind its soldiers, especially when they demonstrate moral courage alongside physical bravery. The promotion would bring new responsibilities, including a Pentagon assignment, focusing on service member advocacy, a role that would allow Terrance to address discrimination issues within a military framework rather than as a private citizen." As Terrance considered this development and its implications for his ongoing involvement with Atlantic Airways and the class action lawsuit, he recognized that the individual incident that had started this journey had evolved into something much larger than himself. What began as a personal experience of discrimination had catalyzed a movement for accountability and transformation, not just within one company, but across multiple American institutions. The question now was how to channel this momentum toward lasting change rather than temporary visibility. As Terrance prepared for his promotion ceremony, he reflected on what his grandmother had taught him about dignity, not as something granted by others, but as an inherent right, claimed through courage and perseverance. The Pentagon's Hall of Heroes provided a fitting backdrop for Terrance's promotion ceremony. The marble walls displayed the names of all Medal of Honor recipients throughout American history, including the black service members, whose contributions had often been overlooked or deliberately obscured until recent historical reckonings. Colonel Harrison had arranged for Terrance's grandmother to attend, despite her health concerns, coordinating with military medical personnel to ensure her comfort throughout the journey and ceremony. Eloise Jackson sat in the front row, elegant in a royal blue dress with a small American flag pin on her lapel, her eyes gleaming with pride as her grandson stood at attention. The Chief of Staff of the Army presided over the ceremony, his presence underscoring the significance of the occasion. His remarks went beyond the standard congratulatory language typical of promotion ceremonies. Leadership comes in many forms, he noted, looking directly at Terrance. Sometimes it's demonstrated through tactical decisions under enemy fire. Other times it's shown by having the moral courage to identify injustice and stand against it, even when doing so carries personal risk. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson has demonstrated both forms of leadership throughout his distinguished career. As Eloise pinned the silver oak leaves on her grandson's uniform, replacing the gold ones that had designated his major's rank, she whispered words only he could hear. "Your grandfather sees this from heaven, baby." Both kinds of courage, both kinds of service. The ceremony received national coverage, interpreted widely as the military's unequivocal statement on the Atlantic Airways controversy. The visual of black excellence celebrated within one of America's most traditional institutions created a powerful counter-narrative to those attempting to discredit Terrance or frame his actions as anti-American. Following the ceremony, Terrance had scheduled a meeting with Angela Reynolds to discuss the customer advocacy board she had proposed. The Atlantic Airways CEO had been making significant structural changes within the company, many of which had initially been met with resistance from entrenched executives. "We've terminated 7 senior managers who were directly involved in dismissing discrimination complaints," Angela explained as they sat in her temporary Washington office. "The corporate culture was more deeply problematic than even I had anticipated." She slid a folder across the desk containing Atlantic Airways' new comprehensive anti-discrimination policy. The document outlined specific protocols for service delivery, transparent criteria for upgrades and special accommodations, and a robust complaint investigation process with external oversight. "This goes beyond the standard corporate diversity initiatives," Terrance observed as he reviewed the materials. "These are substantive, measurable changes." "Because standard initiatives don't work," Angela replied frankly. "I've spent 20 years watching companies make performative gestures while maintaining systemic inequities." This situation provided the leverage to implement real change. Their discussion was interrupted by breaking news alerts on both their phones. The class action lawsuit against Atlantic Airways had expanded to include allegations against 3 other major carriers, with over 200 plaintiffs now participating. Additionally, the Department of Transportation had announced a formal investigation into discriminatory practices across the commercial aviation industry. What had begun as a single incident was catalyzing a sector-wide reckoning. "This is bigger than one company now," Angela acknowledged, her expression serious but determined, "which makes your involvement with our customer advocacy board even more critical. We have an opportunity to establish industry-leading practices rather than merely responding to regulatory pressure." Terrance considered the proposal carefully. His new Pentagon assignment would focus on service member advocacy, creating natural alignment with the role Angela proposed. By working within both systems, military and corporate, he could potentially address structural issues more effectively than through continued public confrontation or litigation. "I'll participate," he decided, with 2 conditions: complete transparency in all board activities and proceedings, and the inclusion of other voices from affected communities beyond my own. Angela readily agreed to both stipulations. "We're announcing the board next week. The public response to your involvement will be significant." The prediction proved accurate. When Atlantic Airways formally announced the Customer Advocacy Board with Terrance as a founding member, reactions split predictably along ideological lines. Progressive commentators praised the move as substantive accountability, while conservative voices criticized Terrance for capitalizing on controversy despite his declining all compensation for the role. More surprising was the response from other corporations. Within days, 2 additional airlines announced similar oversight bodies, followed by hospitality chains and transportation companies. The concept of external accountability mechanisms with real authority began gaining traction across service industries with historical discrimination issues. Maya's investigative series on discrimination in commercial transportation won a prestigious journalism award, elevating her profile nationally. During her acceptance speech, she credited Terrance's courage for making the reporting possible. "Sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones journalists discover," she noted. "They're the ones brave individuals choose to tell despite the personal cost." Their professional collaboration had evolved into a deeper connection over the weeks of working closely together. Maya's intelligence, integrity, and passion for justice resonated with values Terrance had cultivated throughout his military career. Their friendship naturally progressed toward romance, though both maintained appropriate professional boundaries while the story remained active. Kenneth Mitchell also remained an important ally, using his privilege and position to advocate within military circles where Terrance's direct involvement might be constrained by protocol. Kenneth and Terrance established a mentorship program connecting young Black service members with senior officers across racial backgrounds, creating support systems to navigate both military advancement and civilian transitions. 6 months after the initial incident, Atlantic Airways held a special ceremony honoring veterans at their corporate headquarters. The event highlighted the company's transformed approach to military personnel and unveiled a new flight privileges program for decorated veterans regardless of loyalty program status. Terrance attended in his dress uniform, now featuring his Lieutenant Colonel insignia and Distinguished Service Cross. The contrast with his treatment 6 months earlier wasn't lost on anyone present, particularly when Angela Reynolds personally welcomed him with a formal salute, a civilian gesture of respect toward his military service. "Atlantic Airways is a different company today because of you," she told him during a private conversation after the ceremony. "Our customer satisfaction ratings among minority passengers have increased 68%. Employee retention in diverse demographic categories is up by nearly 40%. These aren't just ethical improvements, they're business improvements." The corporate transformation extended beyond metrics and policies to cultural changes within the company. Bradley Cooper, the flight attendant who had treated Terrance dismissively, had been terminated, but subsequently requested to participate in the company's new training programs as a case study in recognizing and addressing bias. His willingness to acknowledge his failings and work toward personal growth reflected wider attitudinal shifts throughout the organization. Heather Phillips, after completing intensive training and demonstrating genuine commitment to change, had been reassigned to a different airport with a 6-month probationary period. Her handwritten letter to Terrance had evolved into regular email correspondence, creating an unexpected channel for ongoing dialogue about bias and accountability. Perhaps most significantly, Atlantic Airways had established a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in aviation careers, with initial funding directed to schools in Baltimore, including Terrance's former high school. When Eloise learned about the initiative, she suggested naming it after Terrance's grandfather, creating a meaningful connection between past struggles and future opportunities. The community center where Eloise volunteered received substantial corporate funding from Atlantic Airways and other companies seeking to demonstrate commitment to change beyond their immediate business operations. The center expanded its programs to include transportation equity advocacy, with Eloise serving as an honorary chairperson despite her limited mobility. As these positive developments unfolded, Terrance reflected on the unexpected journey from airport confrontation to systemic change. During a quiet dinner with Maya at his apartment near the Pentagon, he expressed both gratitude and lingering concerns. "Sometimes I wonder if all this will last beyond the current news cycle," he admitted. "Corporate memory can be conveniently short when profit margins are threatened." Maya considered his words carefully. That's why institutionalizing the changes matters so much. The Customer Advocacy Board, the DOT investigation, the legal precedents from the class action, these create accountability mechanisms that transcend individual leadership or public attention. And people like Kenneth continuing the conversation in spaces where it might otherwise be dismissed, Terrance added, thinking of his friend's ongoing advocacy within military and corporate leadership circles. "Exactly," Maya agreed. "Change happens through both formal structures and informal relationships. You've influenced both." As they discussed next steps in their personal and professional journeys, Terrance's phone buzzed with a notification. Kenneth had sent a message with a link to a just-published article. Atlantic Airways named Most Improved Company in Diversity Practices by Industry Watchdog. The accompanying note read, "Progress isn't always linear, but sometimes it's measurable. Proud to have played a small part in this journey. Couldn't have happened without your courage to speak up that first day." Terrance showed the message to Maya, who raised her glass in a quiet toast. "To speaking up," she said softly. "And to those who make it possible," Terrance added, thinking of his grandmother's wisdom and Kenneth's allyship of Angela Reynolds' corporate courage and Maya's journalistic integrity, the constellation of voices and actions that transformed an individual experience of discrimination into a movement for lasting change. 1 year after the Atlantic Airways incident, Terrance Jackson stood at Reagan National Airport in his full dress uniform, observing the transformed environment with quiet satisfaction. The terminal buzzed with the usual travel activity, but subtle differences were apparent to his trained eye. Staff at check-in counters and boarding gates now wore small pins indicating language proficiencies and cultural competency training. Digital displays rotated through passenger rights information in multiple languages. Most notably, the airline's upgrade list was publicly visible on screens near the gate, showing clear status criteria and current rankings, a transparency measure implemented across the industry following Atlantic Airways' lead. Terrance was traveling to San Francisco for a national conference on corporate accountability, where he would deliver the keynote address about his journey from discrimination target to change agent. His promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and Pentagon assignment had positioned him to influence military-civilian relations in ways he hadn't previously imagined possible. As he approached the Atlantic Airways premium check-in area, he was greeted by a young agent whose professional demeanor never faltered as she processed his first-class boarding pass, a courtesy now standardized for active-duty military traveling on orders. "Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Colonel," she said, her tone genuine rather than performative. "We're honored to have you flying with us today." The interaction was unremarkable in its normalcy, exactly the point of the systemic changes implemented over the past year. Dignity and respect had become operational standards rather than subjective courtesies. As Terrance proceeded towards security, he noticed a young black service member in Army fatigues being directed to the regular check-in line despite visible signage indicating military priority access. The soldier, apparently junior enlisted and possibly on his first official travel assignment, looked confused but compliant, stepping out of the premium lane when instructed by an older white agent. Terrance paused, observing the situation carefully. The incident could have been an innocent miscommunication or a concerning echo of his own experience. Either way, it required attention. Approaching the check-in area, Terrance addressed the agent with professional courtesy. "Excuse me, I believe there may be some confusion regarding military travel protocols." The agent looked up initially defensive until registering Terrance's rank insignia. "Lieutenant Colonel, how may I assist you?" "I noticed this service member was directed away from military priority access," Terrance explained calmly. Atlantic Airways' updated policy extends this service to all military personnel, regardless of rank or class of travel. Perhaps this information hasn't been effectively communicated. The agent's expression shifted from defensiveness to embarrassment. "You're absolutely right, sir. My apologies for the oversight." Turning to the young soldier, the agent's tone transformed completely. "Please accept my sincere apologies, Specialist. Allow me to process your boarding pass immediately." The specialist looked bewildered by the sudden change in treatment, his eyes moving between Terrance and the now accommodating agent. As the situation resolved, Terrance gave the young soldier a subtle nod of solidarity, an acknowledgement of the familiar dynamic they both understood without words. After clearing security, Terrance found the specialist waiting near the gate area, clearly hoping for an opportunity to speak with him. The young man approached with a respectful salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, sir. Specialist Devin Harris. I just wanted to thank you. I wasn't sure if I was in the wrong place, or—" "You weren't," Terrance assured him. "The new policies are clear, but old habits sometimes persist. It's important these moments are addressed directly rather than ignored." The specialist nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "Sir, if I may, you're the officer from the viral video last year, aren't you? The Distinguished Service Cross recipient who changed how airlines treat military personnel." "That's a generous interpretation of events," Terrance replied with a modest smile. "A lot of people contributed to those changes. It made a difference for guys like me," Sir Harris continued earnestly. "My first deployment, senior NCOs told me to expect different treatment regardless of the uniform. After what happened with you, the conversation changed. They started telling us we should expect respect, not just hope for it." The simple statement encapsulated everything Terrance had hoped to accomplish, not merely policy changes, but a fundamental shift in expectations and self-advocacy within the military community, particularly for service members of presence, color. "We're all in this together," Specialist Harris Terrance said, offering his hand. "The uniform deserves respect regardless of who's wearing it." As they parted ways, Terrance couldn't help reflecting on how much had changed in the year since his viral confrontation. The incident that once seemed like a personal humiliation had transformed into a catalyst for nationwide reforms that extended far beyond Atlantic Airways. Under Angela Reynolds' leadership, the airline had become an industry leader in equitable customer service practices. The Customer Advocacy Board that Terrance helped establish now included representatives from various minority communities, veterans groups, and disability advocates. Their recommendations had led to measurable improvements in passenger experiences across demographic groups. More significant was the domino effect throughout the industry. When Atlantic Airways' diversity initiatives resulted in both improved customer satisfaction scores and increased profitability, competitors took notice. What began as crisis management evolved into a business advantage, with companies competing to demonstrate commitment to equitable practices. Terrance's boarding announcement interrupted his reflections. As he settled into his first-class seat, the flight attendant, Bradley Cooper's replacement, offered him a pre-departure beverage with professional courtesy indistinguishable from that extended to other passengers. The normalization of respectful treatment represented the most meaningful progress. His phone chimed with a text from Maya. "Safe travels. Can't wait to see your keynote speech online. Love you." Their relationship had flourished over the past year, withstanding both public scrutiny and the demands of their respective careers. Maya's investigative series on discrimination in transportation had expanded into a book deal and regular television appearances as an expert on corporate accountability. The day after Terrance's speaking engagement in San Francisco, they had scheduled a weekend getaway to Napa Valley, their first vacation together that wasn't connected to work obligations or family visits. The small velvet box tucked in Terrance's carry-on held the promise of transforming their partnership into something permanent. As the aircraft began its taxi, Terrance received another message, this one from Kenneth Mitchell. "Just got confirmation. Pentagon approved full funding for our mentorship program expansion, 20 new locations by next quarter. Couldn't have done it without your advocacy. The program they had established now connected hundreds of young Black service members with senior officers across racial backgrounds, creating support systems for navigating both military advancement and civilian transitions. What began as a response to discrimination had evolved into a proactive framework for inclusion. Heather Phillips, the gate agent whose actions sparked the original controversy, had undergone a remarkable transformation herself. After completing Atlantic Airways' enhanced training program, she requested assignment to the company's military relations team. Her genuine letter of apology to Terrance had evolved into regular email correspondence, and eventually her participation in training videos about recognizing and addressing bias. The hardest part was admitting that I didn't see my actions as discriminatory, she had told Terrance during their first face-to-face meeting 6 months after the incident. I had to confront the gap between how I viewed myself and how my behavior affected others. That willingness to engage in uncomfortable self-examination reflected wider attitudinal shifts throughout the organization and industry. Atlantic Airways now required all employees to participate in quarterly bias recognition workshops with refresher training triggered by any customer service complaints that suggested potential discrimination. The most personally meaningful outcome for Terrance was the scholarship program established in his grandfather's name. Atlantic Airways had committed $5 million over 10 years to support underprivileged youth interested in aviation careers, with funding directed to schools in Baltimore, including Terrance's former high school. Eloise Jackson had recovered fully from her health scare and now served on the scholarship selection committee, bringing her decades of educational experience to identify promising students who might otherwise lack opportunities in the NRAND aviation field. The first cohort of 20 scholars would begin their training programs next fall. The community center where Eloise volunteered had also benefited from Atlantic Airways' community engagement initiatives, receiving substantial corporate funding for transportation equity advocacy programs. What began as a crisis management strategy had evolved into meaningful investment in communities historically underserved by the transportation industry. As his flight reached cruising altitude, Terrance opened his laptop to review his keynote speech. The presentation traced the journey from individual discrimination to systemic change, emphasizing that progress required both institutional accountability and personal courage. The final slide featured a quote from his grandmother that had guided him throughout the controversy. "Dignity isn't something others give you. It's something you claim for yourself." The journey hadn't been without costs. Terrance still occasionally received hateful messages from those who viewed his stand against discrimination as somehow unpatriotic or anti-American. Conservative media figures continued to question his motives, though, with diminishing frequency, as the positive outcomes of the reforms became increasingly difficult to dismiss. These remaining pockets of resistance were far outweighed by the meaningful changes implemented across the aviation industry and beyond. The Department of Transportation's investigation had resulted in standardized training requirements and reporting protocols for all commercial carriers. Congress had passed the Military Traveler Respect Act, establishing clear guidelines for treatment of service members across transportation sectors. More important than the formal policies were the attitudinal shifts. Specialist Harris had described the growing expectation among service members of color that their uniform would command the same respect regardless of who wore it. That cultural evolution represented the most sustainable form of change. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Terrance closed his laptop and gazed out the window at the Golden Gate Bridge emerging through dissipating morning fog. The metaphor wasn't lost on him, clarity emerging where confusion once reigned, connection established where division had existed. The aircraft touched down smoothly, and as passengers prepared to deplane, Terrance noticed a young black flight attendant assisting an elderly white passenger with genuine care and professionalism. The simple, unremarkable interaction represented the normalized dignity he had fought to establish. When he reached the jetway, Terrance spotted Angela Reynolds waiting near the gate area. The Atlantic Airways CEO had flown in specifically to introduce his keynote address at the conference. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, she greeted him warmly. "How was your flight?" "Completely unremarkable," Terrance replied with a smile. "That's exactly what we're aiming for." Angela nodded, understanding the significance of his assessment. Consistent professional service, regardless of who's receiving it. As they walked through the terminal toward the waiting car, Angela updated him on the company's latest initiatives. Atlantic Airways' transformation had exceeded all expectations, with customer satisfaction scores reaching record highs across demographic categories and employee retention, improving dramatically, particularly among minority staff. The most surprising outcome has been the financial performance, Angela noted as they settled into the vehicle. "Our stock price has increased 38% since implementing the reforms. It turns out treating people with dignity is good business. My grandmother would say, doing the right thing usually is," Terrance responded. Speaking of Eloise, Angela continued. The scholarship committee meets next week to select the first cohort. "She's been an incredible advocate for several candidates from your old neighborhood." Terrance smiled, imagining his grandmother's formidable presence in the boardroom, holding corporate executives to the same high standards she had applied to her students and grandson throughout her life. The conference center buzzed with activity as corporate leaders, government officials, and advocacy groups gathered to discuss best practices in diversity and inclusion. Terrance's keynote address was scheduled as the opening session, with attendance exceeding room capacity as attendees sought insights from the man whose airport confrontation had catalyzed industry-wide reform. As he prepared to take the stage, Terrance reflected on the circular journey that had brought him to this moment. 1 year ago, he had stood at an airport gate, denied basic dignity despite his service record. Today, he would address thousands about the transformation sparked by that incident. His phone buzzed with a final text before he needed to silence it, a message from his grandmother. "So proud of you, baby. Remember to tell them, change isn't about policies. It's about seeing each person's humanity." With those words in mind, Terrance stepped onto the stage to share not just his story, but the collective journey toward a more equitable and respectful society. The standing ovation that greeted him reflected recognition not of celebrity, but of the universal desire for dignity that his experience had come to represent. As Terrance began speaking, he noticed Specialist Harris seated in the back row, now in civilian clothes, but recognizable from their airport encounter. The young soldier's presence reminded him that the most meaningful measure of progress wasn't found in corporate policies or legal reforms, but in the daily experiences of individuals previously marginalized by systemic bias. Real change, Terrance told the attentive audience, happens one conversation, one decision, one stand at a time. It requires both institutional accountability and personal courage. Most importantly, it demands that we see each other's full humanity across the divisions that too often separate us. The journey that began with denial of an airline upgrade had transformed into a movement for recognition of universal dignity. As Terrance concluded his address, he invited the audience to continue this essential work in their own spheres of influence, to recognize that claiming dignity for oneself often meant creating space for others to do the same. The applause that followed wasn't just for Terrance, but for the possibility his story represented that systems built on inequity could be reformed, that individuals could catalyze institutional change, and that America could move closer to its founding promise of equal respect for all. Terrance Jackson's story teaches us that true change requires both personal courage and collective action. Standing up against discrimination isn't just about addressing individual incidents, it's about challenging the systems that allow such behavior to persist. When Terrance refused to accept unequal treatment, he He demonstrated that dignity isn't granted by others, but claimed through one's own actions. The ripple effects of his stand show how a single moment of courage can catalyze widespread reform. Atlantic Airways transformed not because one employee acted inappropriately, but because Terrance's experience exposed systemic issues that demanded institutional response. Perhaps most importantly, this story highlights the power of allies in creating sustainable change. Kenneth's willingness to use his privilege to amplify Terrance's experience, Maya's journalistic integrity, Angela's corporate leadership, and Eloise's unwavering support all played crucial roles in transforming an individual injustice into a movement for accountability. The journey from discrimination to transformation reminds us that progress isn't automatic. It requires individuals willing to speak uncomfortable truths and institutions willing to respond with meaningful action rather than performative gestures. True equality comes not from policies alone, but from a fundamental shift in how we recognize each other's humanity across the divisions that too often separate us. What moments of discrimination have you witnessed or experienced? Have you ever spoken up or wished you had in Joe? Your voice matters in creating a more equitable society. Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to join our community dedicated to sharing powerful narratives of courage and transformation. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs encouragement to stand up for what's right. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can build a world where dignity is recognized as everyone's birthright.